Okay, good morning, everybody. I think we're probably ready to start. My name is Nick Hardwick, and I'm a Professor of Criminal Justice here at Royal Holloway. So the first thing to do is to welcome everybody to this webinar. I think we've got people from all over the world joining us. So wherever you are now, it's great that you're able to join us. Just a bit of process things for Zoom. I think we're all used to Zoom by now. So first of all, can everyone put themselves on mute unless they're speaking? That's always helpful. Just in terms of the running order, what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce the authors in a moment. And they're each three of those is going to speak for about 10 minutes. Then we're going to go to the panel. I'll introduce them and get them to give their responses to the book. And then we're going to open it up for questions. You'll see on your menu at the bottom, there is a Q&A function. That's the one to use if you've got questions to ask. And also, I think Serena is about to put a poll up that we're going to use just so we can know where everybody's coming from for this. So if you can fill this in now or later on, that would be great. I think that's probably all we need to say by admin. I think we'll all kind of bear with it. We're used to the nightmare that is Zoom by now, so I'm sure we'll survive it. So maybe just a couple of words, sort of maybe to introduce things myself. This is certainly a timely book. Certainly here in the UK, I think the pressure on prison numbers is ever upwards. There may be a slight downturn in recent months, but it's going to start going up again. And that drive of the increase the prison population is coming not because we're sending more people to prison particularly, but because we're sending people to prison for longer. And the stories that you read in this book and the accounts that you read in this book are an increasingly common phenomenon. A couple of things I want to say about the book myself, just in case they don't get picked up later. The first thing to say is that it's a really good, gripping read. You know, between ourselves, academic books, you couldn't always say that about them, but it's a page turner. You want to know what happened. It's brilliantly written. And for my mind, sort of combines not just a sort of really scholarly analysis, but, you know, high EQ as well, high emotional intelligence as well. Particularly you see that, I think, in the methodology chapter where the authors are talking about their approach. And I think that it's a really powerful page turner of a read, I think. So I'd recommend it to you on that basis alone. And my own observation, what came through for me most strongly about the book is something that I don't think those of us who are concerned about prison reform particularly don't talk enough about, and that's about sometimes the awful things people have done and how the perpetrators feel about it. And one of the things that comes across in the book is how honestly and frankly the people that were interviewed for the book talk about how they feel about their offence and the remorse they feel and how that's affected their lives. And I think unless we have those sorts of conversations, then people are interested in criminal justice are just talking to themselves. And it struck me that prisoners were willing to speak about it more honestly and openly and with sometimes greater insight than those who write about prisoners are able to do. But this book was an exception. This book, I think, covers that area particularly well. It'd be interesting to know what the authors and the panel have to say about that later. But it's not my job to talk today. My job is just to get everybody else talking. So that's what I'm going to do now. The panelists, the authors, I think don't need very much introduction. Ben Crewe, from the Institute of Criminology at the University of Cambridge, is a long list of publications. Certainly for me, his writing's been a big influence in my own thinking about prisons, and I'm kind of grateful for that. Dr. Susie Hulley has worked alongside Ben, I think, on lots of the work that they've done. I think you began, Susie, didn't you, by your PhD around young people and antisocial behaviour. So this maybe brings you to the other end of the spectrum. And finally, Dr. Serena Wright, our own Serena Wright from Royal Holloway, who not only I think is a gifted academic, but an inspirational teacher too. And it's been absolutely learned a lot working alongside her. But that's enough by way of introduction. So I'll hand over to Ben, who's going to kick us off, I think. Ben.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you to everyone for attending. Obviously, we were really disappointed that we had to cancel the March launch in person, but there are far more people attending today than there would have been then, so there are some upsides to all of this, I guess. I'm going to say a little bit about the background to the study and some of the key findings, and then a bit about our next steps. In terms of the background, Susie and I both remember an initial conversation about this study that took place during fieldwork for a previous research project we worked on. And during that project, we both encountered men serving sentences that were exceptionally long, but who seemed resigned to their predicament rather than angry or desperate about it. And both of us were very struck by that. And around the same time, I had a conversation with the director of what was then the high security prison estate, who said that the sense that he had and the sense that his colleagues had was that the composition and nature of the long-term prisoner population was changing. So people were coming in when they were younger. They were often extremely bewildered about why they had found themselves serving such a long sentence. And I think part of this was that they were less professional in their orientation to crime, as it were. And around the same time, various senior practitioners were also expressing quite a lot of concern about the implications for the system itself of having people coming in serving longer sentences starting from an earlier age who might not buy into the system. So the Chief Inspector of Prisons at the time said that her concern was related to disorder. And Michael Spur, who was then the Chief Executive of the National Offender Management Service, communicated quite similar anxieties that managing young people serving very long sentences was one of his main challenges. And so I think there was a shared sense that we were sleepwalking, something that might have really profound consequences, partly for the prison system, partly obviously for the individuals themselves who were serving such long sentences, but also because these very long sentences are the most extreme sanction of the state, there are implications too for the wider politics of criminal and social justice. So we set out with three main research questions. The first was, what are the main problems that people serving very long life sentences experience, and how do they cope with those problems? The second was, how do people build a life for themselves over many, many years of confinement? And our third question was how do people feel about the legitimacy of their situation? And I think our wider objective was to write a really in-depth textured account of what it means and what it feels like to be imprisoned for such a long time. We chose to focus specifically on people who had tariffs, that means the minimum period in custody, of 15 years or more, who were sentenced when they were aged 25 or younger. And overall, we interviewed 126 men and 21 women who met those criteria in 26 different prisons overall. And they ranged from young offender institutions to high security prisons to open establishments. And we deliberately sampled people who were either in the early stage of their sentence, so within the first 4 years, or were around the midpoint of their tariff, or people who were close to their tariff point or beyond it. So the tariff point is the earliest possible date of release. And in terms of our findings, I guess our overall framework for analysis was the idea that long-term imprisonment produced 3 primary dislocations or ruptures. The first is dislocation from the individual's social relationships. In other words, long-term separation from their family members, loved ones in the community, and their other social networks. The second was a sort of dislocation from the individual's sense of self. So by that we mean the challenge to the person's sense of biography, their sense of who they really are, that was caused by being involved in a murder or being labelled a murderer. And the third was a kind of dislocation from the future that the individual imagined they would have, and which obviously they had to reassess, given that their future was clearly radically altered by being given a long sentence. And what we found was that people in the early years of their sentence were overwhelmed by this shattering of what they had previously been able to take for granted about their lives and themselves. And that was exacerbated by the fact that very often they hadn't expected to be convicted or given such a long sentence. And so one of the main arguments of the book, and this thread I think runs through it, is that long-term imprisonment involves a profound and prolonged confrontation with the self as individuals try to come to terms with this set of radical disruptions to their life and a growing awareness of the ethical and existential implications of being responsible in some way for someone else's death. And this kind of reflexive encounter, so this internal conversation, didn't happen from the outset of the sentence. So the prisoners we interviewed who were in the first few years of their sentence were generally engulfed by their emotional response to their circumstances. And almost all of them felt that they had no control over their life. And often they described their helplessness in very binary terms. So I have no control at all because someone else locks me up is quite typical of what people said. And similarly, our early stage participants expressed virtually no sense of hope or meaning. The majority said that they were just living day by day, every day, unable to plan ahead or conceptualize the time in custody that lay ahead of them. And we use a term, temporal vertigo, to try to describe this, this sense that thinking about the amount of time that they were facing could send their head spinning. And when our participants described what it felt like in the first few years of their sentence, they used a language of sinking or stagnating or existing rather than living. And the sort of pains or difficulties of being given such a long sentence when relatively young were more acute and more expansive and more existentially complex than the pains of imprisonment that are conventionally described in the literature. So so were the ways in which our early stage interviewees reacted. So what we describe in the book are forms of suppression through drugs, for example, forms of escape and retreat, including thoughts of suicide, which were very common, and also forms of denial. So denial of the offence, but also denial of the permanence of the situation. So an attempt to pretend that this wasn't really happening or could be overturned. And so these weren't really social adaptation. So this is different from the way that people serving shorter sentences often establish friendships or get involved in trade and so on in order to cope. What we found instead was that these were primarily psychological responses to help resolve interior turmoil. So for example, denying guilt or appealing the sentence were ways of retaining a sense of hope that the sentence might be overturned, or trying to maintain family support. If you've told your family you didn't do it, it's very hard to tell them that you did, but also a way of protecting yourself from having to accept something so deeply shameful. And Nick mentioned this in his introduction. People who were further into their sentences were no longer just...
A couple of minutes, Ben, is that right?
Yeah, that's fine. We're no longer just surviving so much as coping. And we call this swimming with the tide rather than swimming against it. So generally they'd found ways of making their time productive and found domains of control over their emotions or their bodies or the ways they interacted with other people. So this was often a way of trying to emphasize that they were still ethical beings. And what they were also trying to do was to come to terms with the offense itself. So acknowledging, finding ways of processing feelings of shame. And often this was done, and of thinking through the existential issues that I mentioned earlier. And often this was done through forms of faith, education, and therapy. So things that help people make sense of who they were, why things had come to this point, and thinking through what kind of future they wanted. And through all of this time, they were having to navigate two different worlds. So the world outside where their family members were, and then the world inside prison. And over time, they tended to, the prison shifted from somewhere that felt like a non-place, somewhere unreal and not worth investing in, to somewhere that felt like real life. And at the same time, they were very aware that they were becoming non-people in the community. Just 1 minute then about our next steps. Around a few months ago, we were awarded a further grant by the Economic and Social Research Council, which should allow us to re-interview as many as possible of our original interviewees 7 or 8 years on from the initial interview. So this gives us a really extraordinary opportunity to find out more about changes over time and how these are shaped by institutional and personal circumstances. Around 30 of the people we interviewed the first time round have now been released into the community. So we're very much hoping to be able to catch up with them to talk to them about the transition from custody to freedom. And we hope that we'll be able to give, or we should be able to give a copy of the book to everyone who we managed to trace. We think we'll be able to find most people because right from the start of the study, we planned this follow-up. And so we've kept in contact with people and we have their permission to follow them up. And just very quickly, we're engaged in a couple of dissemination activities. One is an episode of the Secret Life of Prisons podcast that we're hoping to record. And the other is a sort of graphic comic, which we're commissioning, which we're hoping to be able to distribute to people starting long sentences across the prison system. This will be a representation of our findings. So that's me. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ben. No, I think that's, I'm certainly looking forward to seeing that next stage, and the comic, indeed. For those people, I'm conscious that some people joined us a bit after we've started. So for those people, I think we're up to about, getting up to almost 200 people now, but for those people, if questions occur to you, do use the Q&A function on your menu at the bottom of the screen to ask questions. And I think Serena is going to be posting a poll, which would be grateful if you filled in so we can just work out where everybody has come from. But I move straight on now to Dr. Susie Hulley, who's going to do the next contribution from one of the authors. Susie.
Thanks, Nick. So for this part, we wanted to draw on our findings from the study to develop a number of key reflections for practitioners. So the first point is that in the early stage, like Ben has said, much of the conduct of lifers was shaped by being flooded by emotions in response to the very extreme situation that they were in. And most were overwhelmed by a primary feeling of anger that was often generated by a complicated mix of feelings of confusion and grief and guilt and shame. For those who were convicted alone, anger was primarily associated with feelings of guilt and shame, while for those who were convicted as secondary parties under joint enterprise, their anger was more typically rooted in feelings of injustice about the sentence, the length of the sentence, their conviction, and about being labelled a murderer when they didn't perpetrate the final blow. And anger tended to be generalised and undirected, and it could spill over into aggression and violence. So Ignacio, who was 3 years into a 17-year sentence that he received when he was 17, said, "I was constantly angry big time. Even if somebody looked at me the wrong way, I'd have probably had a go and had a fight with them." And so for some, including many of the women, anger also leaked out in acts of self-harm. So prisoners at the early stage were also overwhelmed by grief reactions and intrusive recollections. And this involved being haunted by terrible nightmares and dissociative flashbacks, in which they would kind of re-experience the events as if they were happening in the present. And this was often with the associated sounds and smells. And so our main argument here is that we think it's crucial that acts of violence and drug use and other forms of non-compliance among early stage lifers are understood as a reflection of this kind of deep psychological distress. And because these sentences are now so commonplace, we think there's a risk that officers become less sensitive to this distress and the potential problems that this distress generates. And the early stage of the long life sentence is so emotionally fraught that it's a particular time of vulnerability. So feelings of anger and confusion and hopelessness and loss of control risk being harnessed in dangerous ways by extreme narratives and toxic ideologies. And this is particularly the case because the disruptions that Ben described mean that early stage lifers are often searching for quite radical ways of understanding themselves and their situation, and trying to find new forms of meaning and social support. So we think that the language of kind of parking lifers in the early stage of their sentence therefore seems extremely hazardous. So we would argue instead that prisons should help individuals process their emotions and try and find kind of productive ways of channeling them. So for example, through physical activities, through creative pursuits, faith practices and meaningful educational opportunities. Most importantly, many of our participants talked about how they would have benefited from having some sort of neutral and non-judgmental, somebody neutral and non-judgmental to talk through their emotions with, and somebody who wouldn't see it through a sort of risk lens. So the importance of kind of clinical and therapeutic input and attention is also worth highlighting, because so many of our participants also talked about undiagnosed depression and suicidal thoughts. And this was often, but not exclusively, in the early stage. So for example, Rafe reflected and said, "I think everyone who gets a life sentence probably spends the first year or so secretly debating whether they're actually going to do the sentence or not in terms of suicide." Our second point is that the period towards the kind of mid-stage of the sentence was characterised by lifers actively kind of reflecting on and trying to come to terms with their conviction, their sentence and their offence. So this involved ruminating over questions such as, why did this happen? Who am I? If I'm capable of this, whether this was the murder itself or failing to stop someone else commit a murder. What is my place in the world? What does the future hold? And so to answer these questions, participants made use of faith narratives and forms of kind of knowledge and insight that they gained in education and forms of therapy. And these all helped to sort of make sense of their situation. They provided a context, kind of possibility, a sense of the future, and also these like narrative hooks for change and guidelines about how they could live their lives well and ethically. So again, we'd recommend maximising the provision of such opportunities for self-understanding and for personal development. Most lifers were also really keen to make amends and demonstrate that they were good people with productive and redemptive potential futures. Many were drawn to kind of generative activities. So these are activities where you give something back. So for example, peer workers or mentors, and this would be in prison, but also with an eye on, for example, mentoring young people in the community who were committing crime or who were at risk of offending. And so increasing the ways of providing prisoners ways to kind of demonstrate their personal morals and ethics, we think are crucial. Our third point highlights the importance of families. So for most lifers, the key sources of hope were faith and families. So Shafi, who was halfway through a 20-year tariff, said, "If it wasn't for God and my family, I wouldn't be here." And so although friendships often disappeared really relatively quickly, families remained. And although being kind of physically ripped away from family felt extremely painful, families provided a significant source of strength. And it was often the only thing that made life worth living or restrained some prisoners from taking their own lives. And so maintaining family relationships over many years was actually like a practice of survival. Most men in our study, their primary concern was about their parents and particularly their mothers. And for the female participants who were mothers themselves, their central concern was maintaining a relationship with their children. And this could be particularly difficult because of gatekeepers and because often young children found it very difficult to maintain contact themselves. But for both the men and the women, the sort of conventional opportunities for maintaining good family relationships were often limited. So the men and women spoke really enthusiastically about family days, but these occurred rarely, and but they allowed for meaningful and kind of intimate contact with parents and children. So for example, one prisoner talked about being able to take his child to the toilet, and others talked about being able to hug at will. However, prisoners really struggled with the kind of more routine opportunities for contact. So the timing and cost of phone calls and the kind of conventional visits. Lifers desperately wanted to stay close to parents and children, but the format of visits didn't make this easy. So physical touch was restricted. Often they could only hug at the start or the end and the end of a visit. And also emotional intimacy became difficult after many years in kind of different worlds. Communication was really complicated. Prisoners talked about withholding information from their family because they didn't want to worry them, and they knew that family members did the same. Many participants talked about considering stopping or did decide to stop sort of contact with family at some point in their sentence because they found it too emotionally distressing or because the visits became just too socially awkward. And this was particularly likely among the men. So we think that if we're serious about family relationships being the kind of golden thread and being crucial for survival, for psychological well-being and adaptation on release, we think it's vital that we think creatively about how we maintain relationships with family over these long periods. So this might include opportunities to generate meaningful conversations, making new memories together, and enabling some sort of form of intimacy. So one prisoner described how being able to sit next to his family on a sofa had made a huge difference to him. And so our final point is that hope is defined as the combination of an individual's belief in their ability to achieve personal goals, so kind of feeling like they have a sense of personal agency, and being able to see the path ahead towards that goal. And once they got beyond the early stage of their sentence, prisoners often felt kind of more clear-headed and more able to identify those personal goals. And these included, for example, one prisoner wanted to memorize the Quran before he was released, and others talked about gaining degrees and vocational training courses that would sort of be the foundation for a meaningful life on release. However, those towards the end of their sentence, and certainly those who were now over tariff, were struggling to maintain hope. Although most longed for release still, the pathway to freedom had become much less clear for them. And this was often due to kind of bureaucratic, faceless and predictable processes, including long delays to parole hearings that were caused by administrative errors and postponements to temporary release. So in such circumstances, maintaining hope, being able to see how and when release might occur, had become very difficult, and this could lead to feelings of hopelessness and resignation. And so these findings draw our attention to the need for prisons to nurture hope by encouraging agency, providing opportunities to identify, develop and fulfill goals for long-term prisoners. And the end of the sentence pathway must remain as clear of bureaucratic obstacles as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. No, it's a bleak picture, isn't it? Though perhaps there's glimmers of hope in there somewhere. But anyhow, thank you very much
Thank you.
for that. Serena, last but not least, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick. So, so when we were planning this event, one thing that that was really important to all of us, I think, was that we wanted it to be as inclusive as possible. So, as well as being of use to practitioners and academics in our own field, we wanted it to expand to members of the public, experts in other areas. We've also got, as Nick mentioned, people joining us from as far away as Canada and the United States, which is incredible. So I've got kind of 4 things that I think everybody should know about life imprisonment, particularly from young adulthood, based on our own findings. But the first thing I want to do isn't a finding from our research, but just to make sure everyone's on the same page really with their understanding. So that relates to the fact that life imprisonment in England and Wales, despite what the media say, actually does mean life. So life sentences are what are known as a form of indeterminate sentence. So they've got no fixed end, or if there is one, it's 99 years. So they're split into 2 parts. The tariff point that Ben mentioned before is the minimum amount of time that a life sentence prisoner will serve. So that is the time that will be served before they can even be considered for the possibility of release. It's the punishment period, and it is not subject, except in extreme cases with successful appeals, it's not subject to review. It is not subject to time off for good behaviour. That is the minimum time that someone will serve. The second part, once the tariff period is ended and people can then be considered for release, is that the rehabilitative part. So this continues until the end of a person's natural life. A life sentence prisoner will always be on life licence. And just because somebody has served the end of their tariff doesn't mean that they will be let out. That was shown by the Prison Reform Trust last year in statistics highlighting that around 1/5 of all people in prison serving life sentences are beyond the end of their tariff. And I think from our own experience, this isn't a matter of weeks or months, it's years, it's even decades, until individuals are able to satisfy the parole board that they are safe to be released into the public. So I guess the first thing that we would like everyone to really know and understand about life imprisonment for murder is that, again, despite what we read in the papers perhaps, minimum tariffs are getting longer and they are increasing year on year. So the minimum time people are spending in prison for a life sentence is getting longer. So to get a perspective of this, it used to be relatively uncommon for people convicted, even of murder, to serve in excess of a decade in custody. So, for example, in the late 1960s, long-term imprisonment was defined as 4 years, so very different to now. And in fact, at that time, only 2 men had served more than 15 years consecutively. Fast forward to 2013, however, when we conducted our study, and we found more than 800 people serving 15 years at a minimum, and that was just among those who were sentenced when they were under 25 years old. Obviously, that's just the tip of the iceberg. The number of people serving these extremely long sentences include people older than 25 when they were sentenced, and also people in secure psychiatric facilities serving their sentence that we don't hear very much about at all. In our book, we talked about this in terms of the changing currency of prison sentences. You know, that we used to think that a long sentence, what we used to think was a long sentence is no longer the case. What was considered exceptional a generation ago is no longer the case. So the average minimum tariff, for example, rose this century from 12.5 years to just over 21 years in just over a decade. So in 13 years, it increased to just over 21 years. And among our own sample, people that were involved in our study, more than half of the more than 300 people involved were serving in excess of 20 years at a minimum. And remember, these people were convicted in late adolescence, in early adulthood, and in some childhood. So I guess as a nation, we are pretty routinely now giving people, including children, sentences that are incredibly long, and in some cases, many years longer than the number of years that they've actually been alive. one of the other things that we felt it was important for people to know is that we really did find in our interviews very little evidence to support the image of this kind of ruthless or callous defendant in murder trials that we see in media coverage, particularly when the defendant is a young person. So the conversations that we had with people revealed a deep and profound sense of remorse and of shame about their role in the victim's death. None were proud of what they had done, and almost without exception, all were haunted by it years, decades later. They were very aware of the enormity of the offence, and interestingly, when they reflected on the kind of the effective process in the courtroom of hearing the verdict, of hearing the sentence, you know, that phase or that point which is often described in the media as showing a lack of empathy or a lack of remorse as the sentence is passed, was more described to us in terms of shock, in terms of feeling numb, feeling faint, even out-of-body experiences. People were simply unable to process what was happening to them. And I think that even that those who did, and particularly they were young men who demonstrated, I guess, what would be forms of quite crude bravado, so shouting or swearing at the judge, or indeed at the victim's family in the gallery, talked with really deep contrition about this as a kind of a masculinity performance, as a desperate bid to convince other people who might target them in prison, and indeed their own families, particularly their mums, that they were going to be okay, that this wasn't phasing them, and that most expressed this kind of significant sense of shame years later, irrespective of what their intentions were at that time. A life sentence in prison is not easy, and in many ways it seemed to us to be more painful for women than men in certain ways. So in addition to our interviews, we also had over 300 completed surveys returned to us, in which we asked people to reflect on the severity with which they experienced various problems of long-term imprisonment. And what we found was that these problems were very shaped clearly along gendered lines. And while men reported some individual issues, particularly at the earlier stage, with greater severity, women were more consistently reporting greater problem severity across entire areas of the survey, particularly those which relate to their relationships with loved ones. Most were primary carers of children, who more often than not were fostered out, put into adoptive custody indefinitely. They talked about issues with powerlessness and control, about trust and privacy, often in ways that were linked to their extensive histories of childhood abuse, domestic violence, and so on. And women really struggled with the ways in which their intimate daily practices were controlled, their nutrition, their clothing, their menstrual cycles, and their access to sanitary products. And they were really overwhelmed often by the ways in which imprisonment cumulatively over a period of years represented and recreated the dynamics of abusive relationships that they'd experienced. They were far more likely than men to internalize guilt and shame from the offence and their own sense of distress at their situation by inflicting self-harm on the body and indeed attempting suicide. The other thing that I think it's important that everybody knows is that there really is no typical murder, and there is, for that fact, no typical murderer. So when we hear that term murder in the media, I think it tends to conjure up a specific image of a premeditated and evil act. But I think in the lives of the people that we interviewed, murder occurred in many contexts and for many reasons. In a significant number of cases, it was violence gone wrong. In those cases, a very small number of cases where people talked about their kind of intention to do that, it was often because they had been abused or in some way attacked by that person initially. And as I say, this was a very small number. The offence was always almost committed in very fast moving and highly threatening situations, either threat to the person, threat to a loved one, and usually in combination with excessive amounts of drugs and alcohol. And while some did undoubtedly intend to cause serious harm, most didn't start out their day with the intention of taking somebody's life. So to us, this really suggests that the claims of politicians and judges who sort of say that exceptionally long tariffs, these increasingly long minimum terms, are going to be a deterrent, particularly among young people. That seems pretty unlikely to us. For something to act as a deterrent to people individually or more broadly, the punishment needs to be swift, it needs to be certain, it needs to be proportionate. And the deterrent potential of it depends on people understanding what the law is, the intricacies of it, what the potential punishment might be for what acts. The fact that most claimed that they hadn't intended to end somebody's life and therefore shouldn't be guilty of murder, I think really demonstrated to us that they weren't aware of the criteria for a homicide conviction. And the fact that most committed the offence while intoxicated or enraged or in some state that wasn't necessarily thinking rationally, really left little scope for a kind of a reflection ahead of time about the potential outcomes and consequences for both the victim and themselves. Thank you, Nick.
Well done. There we are. See, what perfect timing. Thank you. That was, and I think that sort of discussion of some of the myths that exist around this is really important given the seriousness of the topic. So we're now going to move on to our second panel to respond. So those of you watching have to imagine the first panel shuffling off the stage and the second panel shuffling on. And while they're shuffling on, I'll introduce them. So first of all, we're going to hear from Owen James. Owen, as he says in his biography, himself served 20 years, a mandatory life sentence, and then has emerged from that now to be an acclaimed writer, I think, not just a columnist and books, but now giving prisoners themselves a voice through his editorship of the Inside Time. And if people don't already read Inside Time, then I would recommend it to you. So welcome, Owen. We're also joined by Peter Dawson. Peter's director of the Prison Reform Trust. Peter's made his own journey, I think, from prison policymaker to prison governor, and now running one of the most respected prison reform organisations in the UK. And finally, reporting from the front line, as it were, pleased to welcome Rachel O'Rourke, who's the head of psychology at HM Young Offender Institution, Aylesbury, which holds a lot of the young men that we've been talking about so far. And Giles McCarthy, have I pronounced that correctly, who is the directorate lead and psychologist for the Youth Custody Service. And they're going to combine, I think, in their presentation. So looking forward to hearing what all of you got to say. And we're going to kick off with you, Owen. So over to you.
Oh, thank you, Nick. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's amazing and lovely and privileged to be part of this book launch. This book, I have to tell you, I've read lots of through my prison experience and then post prison as a writer. I've read lots of academic books on prisons, but this, for me, is the most authentic sort of encapsulating piece of work that really gives a flavor and a sense of the reality of what it's like to get a life sentence. You know, I just listening to Ben and Susie and Serena, the way the depth that they've got into this issue, into the lives of the people serving this sentence. I find it incredibly moving, actually, because I mean, I've been out of prison now 15, coming on 16 years. I did serve my 20 years. But I still think about this as an editor-in-chief of Inside Time, which I'm really proud to be that. You know, but prison issues. I never had a plan when I was in prison to be somebody with a voice in the prison debate. Really, there was no plan at all. I went in there without any hope, without any sort of sense of what it was all about. But listening to Susie and Ben and Serena, they've really got into the lives of the people serving those sentences at different stages. You know, the early stage, the middle stage, and then the sort of relatively final stage. There is no final stage, as Serena said. Life is life in this country. 99 years. I'm still serving my sentence. You know, I'm in this lovely little my little writing den and you know, I've got a relatively privileged life, which I never think that you know, I never take this for granted. I'm not complacent about this, but I've had issues. You know, you come out of prison, you do 20 years in jail, and you come out and be a member of society. And this is the thing that these kids, these young people, I say kids with, you know, with all due respect, I'm now an old man, but you know, I was in my mid-20s when I went to prison for life, and you don't really know what's coming. The things that Serena and Ben and Susie have elicited from these real living human beings who are trapped, who are incarcerated, and mostly deservedly so. I'm not sympathetic to people, you know, poor prisoners did terrible things in prison. It's not, for me, it's not about compassion. But what they've done is they've actually, the things that you'll find in this book, prisoners serving those sort of sentences don't share together. This is what they've found is the secret life of prison. I talk about this podcast. They've actually got the secret life of lifers. That's what this book has done. You've actually got it, because I often say, you know, you can be a prison officer on a prison landing for 30 years and you will not understand the dynamics of the prisoner hierarchy. You will not understand what it's like to be a prisoner. You might think you can, you might boast to your friends or talk about being, oh, I'm in charge of lifers and murderers, and you know, unless you're in that, when you're in that sort of twilight zone of being a life prisoner with other life prisoners. And then obviously there are very few all lifer prisoners. I think Gartrey's one, but often lifers, you're mixed in with the general population, and it's really difficult to understand how you live that life. And I got to tell you this, you know, I got my deservedly life sentence. You know, I've got no issue with what happened to me at all. I you know, and most lifers will tell you the same sort of thing as this book tells you. It's a shock. It's numbing. You try and figure out how the hell what's happened here. You know, was I born bad? Was I made bad? Did I choose to be bad? How have I ended up in this grotty, stinking cell in Wandsworth with a bucket for a toilet and 3 sets of bars on the windows, and this is my whole life for the next God knows how many years? You know, you sort of you sit and you think, well, how the hell? You try and figure it out. And I think what Susie and Ben and Serena have done with this book is they've allowed us, the general population, the academics, the whole world, they've allowed us into a secret place that I don't think this has been done before. You know, all the stuff I've read before, this has never been done in such a way that I read it and I think, my God, they understand it, they've got it. You know, there are very few academics who sort of get this. I think Alison Liebling, for me, is one of the sort of prominent people in the country who understands this. But Ben and Susie and Serena have done an amazing job with this book to bring this situation out into the wider world for people. Anybody can understand it. Now, if you're a victim of crime, a victim of a murderer, you don't care how long they serve, how much punishment is enough. If you've been harmed by someone like I was, it's, you know, how much punishment is enough? How long sentence is enough? But I remember when I got my time, when I got my life sentence, at the same time, there were a few Irish terrorist convictions at the same time. You know, there was one guy who'd multiple murders, terrorist murders, Irish terrorist murders, who got a minimum 35 years. He was out in 14 years under the Good Friday Agreement. But the murders that I think there were about 8 murders, he got a minimum of 35 years. There were two people convicted of, you know, terrible, really terrible serial killing murders of over 10 people each that killed people, and the judges gave them minimum terms of 25 years, because in those days, I'm talking about that, you know, the early 80s, 25 years was like, my God, who's going to live through that? And now we give young people tariffs of 20 years, 25 years, 35 years, 42 years. And I wonder, where do these numbers, how do they calculate what crime deserves how many number of years? And as Serena said, these are minimum terms to be served. There's no there was in the early days, there was an appeal process. You could sort of put representations forward years ago to say, look, I've made some progress, I've educated myself, I'm remorseful, I'm not a bad person, can I have my tariff reduced? And now that's sort of gone, it's the minimum term. So when somebody gets a 32 years or 27 years or 18, that's what you will serve if you survive it.
Do you want to start to draw to a close now?
Well, here I am. So I'm just, listen, I'm grateful that I live in a society still prepared to give people like I was a second chance. But what's been happening over the past, 20 years or so, that is becoming more begrudging. That second chance is becoming more begrudging. And I hope this book brings to practitioners, to politicians, to people who are involved in all this. I hope this book brings, humanization to this whole process, because this is the thing, as Serena said, when you talk about murders and murderers, you think about the most evil people on the planet. But what this book demonstrates is these people are not the most evil people on the planet. Often they're damaged, they're troubled. It doesn't undermine the pain they've caused. But my goodness, let's get back, let's bring back the death penalty, or get real with these sentences, because otherwise it's death by prison. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And I'm sorry to stop you so soon, actually, on that cheerful note. I think you're right. In the book, one of the things you summed it up to me, as you often do, about the book opening a window on a really hidden world that it would be so difficult to understand or see really otherwise. So thank you for that. Just to remind people that the Q&A function is open. So we are interested in what your questions and comments are that we can pick up when we get to the discussion section later. But now I'm going to move quickly on to Peter Dawson. Peter, over to you.
Thanks, Nick. I'm going to start with a small confession. Every week, the director of the Prison Reform Trust will issue a portentous statement about a recent report offering an authoritative view on it. And normally that director would have read the first page and the last page and maybe one in the middle. That's not true with this book. I read this book from cover to cover, and I would really recommend everybody to do the same. And for reasons which echo actually what Erwin was saying. First of all, I think it allows you to understand at an emotional as well as an intellectual level why this subject is so incredibly important. Second, you will hear directly from the people experiencing this extreme punishment. Thirdly, I think you'll be challenged about what you may or may not have understood so far about this subject. Like all the best books, it leaves you plenty to think about. And fourth, I'm not really qualified to say this, but it did seem to me to be an absolute object lesson in how you carry out research in such a sensitive area with real humanity and care for the people involved. But when you've read it cover to cover, you should expect that you will be seized by the dilemma of what to do about what you've read, particularly when the political context, as others have said, remains so punitive and so detached from the real people that the book describes. So I was going to just say something very briefly about 4 ways in which I think the Prison Reform Trust is trying to rise to that challenge, and I hope there will be people out there who will help us in that. First of all, we are engaged in trying to find ways to give prisoners a role in strategic advocacy. I mean, that sounds like jargon, but it's actually a very simple and familiar idea. No one understands prisons better than prisoners, but the people in a position to influence policy with the networks, the resources and the platform to do that are actually people like me. So we need to make those tools available to the people who know most, not just to hear what they have to say, but to equip them to influence. Thinking about this in a completely different context this week, it struck me that the difficulty that the government machine has with Marcus Rashford and free school meals is not that he tells his story or that he diagnoses the problem correctly. It's that he has the temerity to suggest a solution, and he might be right about the solution. And that's what we need to give prisoners the opportunity to do, to tell us how we can make things better. And so we've been building on a long tradition at PRT of involving prisoners with the appointment of Paula Harriott, who many people on this webinar will know, 3 years ago, and the creation of the Prisoner Policy Network, which now has about 1,000 members. So that theme of prisoner involvement is central to our second response to the challenge of this book, which takes the form of a 5-year programme, wonderfully funded by the National Lottery Communities Fund and led by Dr. Dave Maguire. We've called it Building Futures. Whatever happens, for the foreseeable future, prisons are going to be holding the men and women whose lives are described in this book and serving the barely imaginable sentences that it also describes. The programme Building Futures is about giving those people a means to influence what their way of life in prison should be. The book is already something of a Bible for that programme, and we've been hugely heartened by the enthusiastic response from both inside and outside the prison service to the work that we have planned. The third piece of work I want to mention is an imminent publication of research by Kimit, Edgar, Mia Harris and Russell Webster into the experience of recalled IPP prisoners. So we won't give up the fight to find a way of finally closing the book on the IPP sentence, but we know that's not imminent. The incidence of recall, which now exceeds the rate of release of IPP prisoners, however, is something that can be altered now. Again, the wisdom of prisoners is what this research will bring to the table within the next few weeks. And finally, I just wanted to mention something called the Independent Commission into the Experience of Victims and Long-Term Prisoners. And I think this speaks to something you said right at the start, Nick, about being prepared to listen to the people who have been victims of crime as well as the people who have committed it. PRT set up this commission and we're assisting its secretariat, but it is genuinely independent of us. It's chaired by the former chair of the Hillsborough Inquiry and the former Bishop of Prisons, James Jones, with a panel of independent experts, some of whom are extremely familiar with prisons and with victims, and others who served on the Hillsborough panel. Its aim is to consider from first principles how we approach the punishment of the most serious crime, which is why its determination to hear from victims as well as perpetrators is so crucial. I think that the absence of serious political thought on this issue during a prolonged period when Parliament has been prepared repeatedly to sanction punishments of exceptional cruelty is a scandal. I've no idea what the Bishop will conclude, but I am certain that he will prompt a better informed and more thoughtful debate. The Commission is currently inviting evidence and has its own website where you can find its terms of reference, membership and how to get in touch with it. And those details with the email addresses of all the people at PRT that I've mentioned are going to be circulated with the notes of this event. So please read this outstanding book. Be gripped by the human and societal tragedy that it describes and encourage others to do the same.
Thank you, Peter. It's couldn't agree with you more, really, about lots of the issues that you raise. We'll move on now, perhaps to we've looked at this from different perspectives, and now we're going to hear from people who work directly with some of the people that the book discusses. So I'll begin with Giles, first of all.
Thank you, Nick. So firstly, I'd like to say thank you for inviting both myself and Rachel to contribute to this. It's an absolute privilege to do that. And I'd also like to congratulate Ben, Susie and Serena on producing what feels an excellent resource and I think will be a benefit to academics, but also practitioners for a considerable time to come. My observations, of course, are very much taken from the youth custody service and looking at the challenges faced by individuals that are primarily going to be at the very start of these significantly long sentences. Rachel will no doubt then talk more about from a Young Offenders Institute over the age of 18. So it was really interesting to get an insight from the individuals serving these sentences, but I also couldn't help thinking about some of the insights shared by those that work with these individuals and what that impact is on the staff across the service. Chapter 2 stood out to me in the methods, which no doubt offers a useful insight, not only on the construct of the study, but I also thought it captured the experiences of working with this complex group of people. The authors, you describe your experiences as both bleak and uplifting at the same time. And you note your sort of general response at the end of the day being contemplative silence and animated analysis. And I couldn't help thinking about how does that relate to staff who experience working with these individuals every day, but more so practically, the absolute importance of offering support and space for them to reflect on this, if we're seriously going to expect them to fulfill their roles in caring and supporting those in custody and doing that well. I thought the early years chapter, of course, it particularly drew my attention on how many of the assumptions are disrupted. And in particular, what you note is the almost total breach of self. The point which stands out throughout the book was the coming to terms with such long sentences for me. And during these early years, how it was noted as survival was paramount, and the reactive defences that were deployed by these individuals just to survive. And I think understanding these behaviours as responses to this and recognising them as such is no doubt practically important, again, if we're going to effectively support these individuals. And of course, both the act of the crime and also the subsequent sentence, you also note as having a critical impact on the individuals, and therefore as such, I think must be considered part of their experience rather than simply as a way to define who they are. And I think for me, this speaks really well to what we're striving to achieve in youth custody services in adopting this child-first approach. And also throughout the service, this trauma-informed approach, where we start to consider the backgrounds and the experiences of individuals necessary to be taken fully into account, and that to plan the journey of work and support that we can offer. But what was really compelling throughout the book was the sense of self and development of identity remains a core feature, and supporting that transition is no doubt of key importance if we're going to work constructively with these individuals. You note that a fifth of the group was sentenced to life imprisonment when they were still children. And no doubt that's going to further complicate the process of their adolescent development, with it being undertaken in a custodial environment. And furthermore, recognising how this self-develops through the course. But there's too much to cover in these few minutes I've got. But what I did think is the accounts from Seb, Gail, Campbell, Dina, Richard, Mahmood are compelling, but as are how you follow that thread throughout the rest of the book. And it's a real view and insight into that. The overall humanistic angle is also helpful, from the Christmas card sent to the participants, and the reflection on the individual voices carried through the text is a real personal experience behind their sentences. And it's a great insight from the perspective of those who experience that most acutely. So it's really valuable to hear those voices and reflect on that. And I think practically it's going to be exceptionally valuable. I'll hand over to Rachel at that point. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Giles. That's a really good, I think, endorsement for someone who's got such a central important role in dealing with this. So last but not least, Rachel.
Lovely, thank you. Thanks, Giles, and thanks for the opportunity to be here and speak to the issues raised by the research in this book. It's close to my heart. And the importance of this book, its contribution to the evidence base and the experiences told within it are invaluable from my point of view. As part of the long-term high secure estates review of very long sentence young adults that we started conducting last year, Ben was kind enough to share his preprint chapters with me for our review of the literature. And it was the missing piece in a fairly old and older adult focused literature. So whilst an understanding of institutionalization in the way it's defined in other literature, post-incarceration syndrome, the emotional impact of long sentences, masculine identity, it's all relevant, but it's no longer comprehensive enough. It's no longer a comprehensive enough understanding of our current situation with our current cohort. And as the sentences are now longer and the tower is higher and the age of sentencing is younger, the practitioners like myself in these sites caring for these boys and young men are in need of evidence and best practice. What we need now is a more nuanced understanding of how to better care for these boys and young men, and to do that we need good evidence around the impact of the sentences at different stages on themselves, their families and their development. We need to understand how they seek to cope with the effects it's having on them, and also I think why it might be different for different groups. Young adults in our justice system have experienced a high number of adverse childhood events, and this sentence trauma and the offence trauma that was referred to as well, it adds to that. Many of these young people as well are from ethnic backgrounds, and in numbers suggesting disproportionately so. And with the news bringing these youngsters daily proof of discrimination, brutality and ignorance, our challenge in the prisons is to find ways to still settle them into a lengthy period of time in custody, which involves accepting and engaging with a system which is hard to trust. So this book has been key to our understanding of how to better support and manage our longer sentence residents, both at the YOY where I work and for the long-term high secure sites review, which is ongoing. The coping and adaptation chapter for me as well is one I'd refer my professional colleagues to. I know there's a number of clinical and operational colleagues from Aylesbury on the Zoom. It's got real utility, chapter 5, for describing the lived experience of our residents, but also for the need for us to pick up the challenge to provide imaginative and early intervention to support them whilst they navigate these early years. That's it. I look forward to hearing the questions and thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rachel. So, and again, good to know that you think it's relevant to your work. I can see that. Well, we've got some really good questions already on the Q&A, and I'm going to try and pick out some that seem to be asked by a number of people. There's a, to begin with, maybe for the authors, actually, a question from Jack Tomlin, but others asked a similar point about the extent to which there was a series of group membership or solidarity between the lifers. And somebody else asked about whether, you know, the extent that extended beyond lifers to other prisoners. So how far were relationships between prisoners, whether lifers or not, important for them coping with their situation? Let's go in a random order. Do you want to start with that, Serena?
Thanks. Thanks, Nick. While I was looking at the Q&A, yeah, I think it was interesting. So I did see the questions about kind of like lifer units and who preferred what, and was there a sense of solidarity? I think some of the older lifers certainly talked about a situation where they felt that staff had more knowledge of them, understanding, support. Lots kind of lamented the loss of specific lifer support officers, you know, that kind of were understanding of them. And I think some really struggled with the being among other life sentence prisoners, because after serving 10, 15, 20 years, you just kind of run out of new conversation. But on the other hand, if you are in other prisons with short sentence prisoners, you have the pains of seeing people going in and out and feeling like they're wasting their life. Shall I hand over to Ben and Susie?
I don't mind speaking about this. So yeah, I think like Serena said, there was kind of a bit of a mix where some people definitely didn't like to be around short-termers and found it really difficult seeing them going home, but others felt that less so. I think one thing that's important is that friendships from outside prison really did disappear relatively quickly. So actually in that kind of vacuum, people did develop friendships with other prisoners, and really meaningful friendships and relationships over many years. Obviously lifers often kind of end up in the same prison, so they might not see somebody for a number of years and then come back to seeing somebody. But within the prison they were in at that point, they often did develop these relationships over many years. And also one other thing to say was that in terms of the kind of lifer units, prisoners often talked about liking being around lifers who were later in their sentence or who were older, because they offered kind of hope and they also offered advice. So the women in particular, because they often are in, they often do see each other a lot because there's not many places for female lifers they're likely to end up. They often talked about really building really strong relationships, but also really gaining from having somebody that they could see that this is survivable, that they could see at the early stage, you know, that this is what life later on, life sentence later on looks like, and it is possible to make it feel meaningful and things like that.
Ben, rather than pulling in on that question, maybe ask you to address a slightly different point that's come up a bit, which is to respond a bit to something that Giles raised in his contribution about the impact of this on staff themselves. I know we've got quite a lot of prison staff themselves with us on the webinar today. And I just wondered, Ben, about whether either in this work for this study or in future plans, you've got thoughts on both about how working with these prisoners affects staff, and what more are the things that individual staff could be doing over and above, in a sense, wider policy questions.
Yes, it's a really good point that Giles raised. We started our fieldwork in Gartree prison, which is a prison that only holds lifers. And our original plan was to conduct quite long interviews with officers about the specific challenges of managing people serving very long sentences. And what we found quite quickly, and were slightly deflated by, was that officers had very little to say about what it might mean, about the particular practices that might be worth investing in when dealing with people with such long sentences. And I think this is because, as Susie and Serena both mentioned, that it's very easy to see why staff stop noticing that these are life-changing, exceptional sentences, because they're no longer that exceptional. If you're in a prison like Gartree or Aylesbury, a very high proportion of your of the prisoners who you're looking after will be serving very long sentences. So actually, I think it's very easy for officers to lose sight of the fact that that people are going through something extremely unusual and traumatic. One thing I do think is important, and this hopefully came across in what the three of us said initially, is that certainly our interviewees wanted to have opportunities to talk about what they had done and how they felt about what they had done and its impact on other people. And there is something ironic about the fact that if you're serving a 25-year tariff life sentence, this particular thing you did on a particular day is the reason why your life has changed. But there's very little discussion once you're in prison about why that thing happened and what it means to you and how you feel about it. And as Susie said, I think most prisoners wanted opportunities to talk about the offence itself, but not simply through offending behaviour programmes, which they often felt were not well tailored to their individual circumstances and made certain assumptions about them and what kind of person they were or were likely to become. So if I had one recommendation, it would be that officers try to engage in sort of daily conversations with people about the offence and its impact on them, and of course its impact on victims and victims' families, which again was something that people were our interviewees were very, very aware of. The victims were a kind of constant presence in their minds. And I think it's very easy for staff, just as it is for researchers, to shy away from having discussions about these things because it feels awkward, it's potentially insensitive, you could re-traumatize people. But I think having a degree of courage about entering into those discussions feels very important. And of course, if people do that, then they may require themselves forms of support, because these are not easy conversations to have with people. They're not easy conversations for prisoners to have either. So that would be my one observation about that point.
Can I just add to that? Sorry, Nick, I just wanted to add to that because there was a question that came in as well about creative opportunities and people using kind of theatre and things. And I think that's another way of engaging this dialogue between staff and prisoners, because for another study I carried out, we did some creative methodology and we did some body maps. And it was really noticeable. It was actually a prisoner who was serving life for murder under joint enterprise who did this particular body map. And then a member of education staff came in and was really taken by it. And so the prisoners started talking through the map and kind of their experience of being convicted under joint enterprise and how angry he was about it. And the member of education staff actually said, I really see you in a new light now. And I think just having that, having a sort of a basis of that conversation that is a little bit less direct, maybe in those conversations like Ben's from, having a sort of creative opportunity to talk through what's going on for people, I think really does open people's eyes to the really lived experience of what's going on for that person.
I think maybe this leads us to another question. Is from Harry Anderson and others, Joe Shingler, hello Joe, Mark Conway, about how the parole system plays into all of this. This willingness, this desire in a sense to talk about their offence, to talk about it. How does the parole system play into this? Does it create a sense of hope or despair? Is it light at the end of the tunnel, or as they say, another train coming? I don't know whether, maybe stick with you, Susie. Do you want to have a go at that one first?
I think I will pass it on to Serena in a moment, but I will say one thing that that I think the thing that Ben's talking about and the thing that we're talking about talking about the offence, there is also a risk as time goes on of making people talk about it over and over again, and they often talked about kind of pulling off the scab. And I think by the time they get to the sort of point of the parole process, they might be 15, 20 years down the line, they might have made all this progress, they certainly do still think about the offence, and they still do feel guilt and contrition and things, but kind of being asked to keep going back to the day of the offence and talk through the offence again. They talked about kind of sort of feeling like they were beginning to heal and then somebody ripping the scab off again. So I think these conversations, I think we're primarily talking about in those early years where it's very difficult to talk about what's going on for prisoners, but actually they really benefit from having some conversations about what they're going through and things like that. And I think actually the parole process, it actually makes it very difficult then to have to keep going for different reports for the reports that in the run up to the parole and then in the parole board, having to keep going over that, what happened on that particular day, when often people find it very traumatic to talk about, is actually quite difficult. But yeah, I'll pass on to Serena because she's done a little bit more on the kind of late stage stuff.
Yes, Serena.
Thanks. So yeah, I think with the late stage, we've been looking particularly at people who were 2 years ahead of their tariff end date, or in many cases were beyond that. And I think that there was definitely a lot of challenge, as Susie says, around this ripping off of the scab. And I think we've talked quite a bit. I know Ben has mentioned the stuff around kind of this opportunities for ethical selfhood and these ideas about how you demonstrate and show this new identity. Certainly this will be familiar to anyone who knows the desistance literature. How do you show that you are a different person, or that you are the person you were always meant to be, or that you are not the same person? Who among us is the same person we were when we were 18? I'm glad I'm not. And the people who are in those scenarios, the things that they do at those ages that then follow them around for the rest of forever, that perhaps there could be other ways of having different conversations that do not kind of consistently reduce a person back to the worst thing that they have ever done, that really, and find other ways of, I did see some of the other questions on the chat that asked about, this disconnect between kind of the cynicism perhaps and the risk focus that is very central to the parole process or the pre-psychology report process, and then kind of what prisoners are saying themselves. So I don't know whether it would be sensible at this point to bring in any of our practitioners or anyone else that would like to speak.
What I thought I'd do now is maybe just particularly on the parole point about how that works. And there's also questions about sentencing planning, which is similar issues really. So maybe I could just ask whether Giles and Rachel want to come in on that point at all about how their role in that issue interconnects with the stuff in the book. And then maybe I thought I would go following that, just so you know where I'm heading, is go to perhaps Peter and Erwin about some of the wider sort of policy questions that have come up, both around parole and question from Teresa Etheridge about the new sentencing white paper and your views on that. But perhaps just sticking to the parole question, first of all, about and sentence planning, but how does that work? And does that do, is this a preparation for that? Does that do more harm than good almost? I don't know whether, Giles, do you want to have a go at that one?
Okay, I can start. I think it's interesting talking about sort of peeling the scab off. I think it's Gail that is noted as saying that. And I think it's a really powerful quote. But I also think there's something said later about an individual that you've named as Arcan, about this isn't the person I was then, it's different. And I think for me, I mean, largely in youth custody services, of course, we're talking at the very start of these sentences. And often the parole process will come much further down the system. But one of the things we're really focused on is it's about not defining individuals by one specific event or one specific action. And that, I guess, is preliminary what Child First is about. They're not a violent offender or so on. They're a child that has a whole complicated background to them. So one of the things we're putting in front of sentence planning is this whole idea of case formulation, and we simplify it, we just call it my story. And I think that to me is the critical bit about it. And it's not just one profession or specialist, it's multiple sources, multiple inputs to build a whole picture of what that individual is. And there's no surprise that for children in custody, when we look at registering complex issues that we're worried about, we're as much worried about them potentially being at risk from others as we are about them being at risk to others. And I think to me that contextualizes the whole thing, that they are more than that offence. And I think if we're going to understand or support them going through a sentence, we need to pull that picture together, because otherwise it does feel really unfair and really sort of the deck's stacked wrongly, isn't it, that they're more than that offence. So I think that for me is the start of the process. I don't know whether, Rachel, you've got anything you'd add on that?
Just a couple of things. There's something about we're only ever as good as our evidence base is, and I think we're catching up now. I think in just speaking as a forensic psychologist, and I saw Joe Shingler ask this question, you know, papers like Joe has produced, you know, informs our understanding of how to do better and how to do holistic assessments. I don't know of anyone in the teams that I work in who would dare just do a risk assessment on a young adult. They would always balance that with the strengths assessment as well. And we now have adapted strengths validated tools that are validated for young adults as well. We didn't have them before. I've been working at Aylesbury for 15 years. We had hardly any tools available to us that were adapted for young adults, never mind holistic assessments. So there's that. There's also the issue, unfortunately, of resources. When I came to Aylesbury, we were always only ever meeting the lad at the point of writing the report. And that gives you a very narrow lens of anyone. And now I have the luxury of a team who meet the lad as soon as he gets there. And we're involved in producing a summary of that guy, like a case formulation, as Giles, we call it, about me at Aylesbury. Every lad gets that and has been getting that this year at Aylesbury as well, to inform a much wider view of someone rather than what it is that they did that brought them there, in order to better rehabilitate them.
Thank you. Maybe go to Peter and Erwin now. There's been a few sort of what you might describe as more political or policy questions that have come up that you might want to talk about. So questions about parole itself, questions about where there's, you mentioned this, Peter, indeterminate sentences for public protection play into all of this, and the new sentencing white paper, a so-called smarter approach to sentencing. How's that going to impact on all of this? So you can talk about all three of those, or take your pick. Do you want to start, Peter? And you've got strict time limits as well to make
Sure.
it for you.
Okay, well, quickly then, just on parole, one of the things that really struck me about the book was this theme that the way that you cope with imprisonment can disable the skills that you need to cope outside prison. And the work that we're just about to publish on IPPs shows lots of people failing, not because they're about to commit heinous further offences, but because life is collapsing around them and they're not getting the support, but they're not also equipped to live a normal life. So perhaps there's something about the parole assessment and the way people are prepared for parole, which is about the skills to live outside prison, and a system that gives those skills, and not just about risk. But the white paper is a very curious beast. If you keep going with it, eventually you get to parts which don't make you so angry. But the first bit is shocking, is cruel. I think it's cowardly in the way that it is prepared to write off people. And it feels that we are being encouraged to do a deal, which is that if we will accept that we will be very, very punitive towards the very worst people, that somehow makes the space to do something more progressive for everybody else. And you know, any of us who have been anywhere near prisons know that you don't walk into a prison and find that the very wicked people are standing in one corner with a sign on their heads and everybody else is in the other corner. The book demonstrates that. It shows that real lives are much more complicated than the political narrative. And I think we must just resist that deal. And the very last thing on IPPs, I mean, it's Groundhog Day. There is really dangerous language about government having a responsibility to protect everybody from the possibility of future serious crime. Well, you know, that's a very foolish thing for government to promise. You know, when I was a civil servant, the first thing you learned was don't let ministers promise something they can't deliver. And they can't deliver that. And it's not honest with the public and it's not honest with victims to say so. So we must challenge that.
Okay, thank you. And Owen, have you got thoughts on any of those issues?
Well, a couple of thoughts, if I may. I'm just, you know, it's great hearing Giles and Rachel, because without people like Giles and Rachel, I would never have made it to be where I am. You know, I got out, you know, into a life that I never expected, a good life. But the problem we have with our prisons is that you go there and you got to survive. I don't think that anybody should go to prison to survive. You go to prison because you've done, you know, a bad thing, a terrible thing, an awful thing, an unpleasant thing. You go to jail. Once you're in jail, something nurturing and good should happen. And you know, if people really don't want to change their attitudes or change their lives, well, that's fine. Keep them in. But most people I met, you know, over 20 years in prison, Nick, the vast majority of people I met didn't like being bad people, didn't like being people who hurt other people. They you know, they looked at their issues and stuff. But without the people like, I mean, I've got to say Rachel and Giles again because you're there. But I met people like Rachel and Giles in jail who helped me. This is the sort of really odd sort of dichotomy where we have people in prison who work to help people in prison to become better people. But then we have society and the politics that don't want to let those people out, you know. So it's really such a challenge. We need to look to Scandinavia, where they hate murderers and rapists and pedophiles and terrible people. They hate them. They work to help them because their society is safer from those people once they've been helped. That is the challenge for any civilized society. How do we help people who've hurt us? But if we can do that, we will make our society safer. That's all I'm going to say, Nick.
Thank you. We're almost, I'm afraid, out of time. But I actually wanted to go back to Ben. Maybe one is to pick up a point that Owen's just made about, Ben, you may be able to answer about how we can learn from the experience of other countries in dealing with people who are serving these sorts of sentences. And indeed, you know, what we've got guests here from India, Pakistan, a few questions from them and for other parts of the world about how replicable you think your findings are. And then secondly, to end maybe a question from Anna Schlehi, I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, where she talks, Anna asks about your next stage and the next stage of the research and whether you're going to be using some of the concepts you've worked on before, like the kind of breadth and depth of imprisonment, as part of the way that you analyze what happens next. So do you want to maybe conclude, Ben?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's very hard to know whether we would find the same results elsewhere, but certainly I think the themes are found fairly consistently certainly in the sort of global north. So Laura Abrams has done is involved in a similar research project in the US with juveniles given life without parole sentences who have subsequently been released because of legislative changes. And the consistency between her findings and ours is very, very striking. And we, as part of our study, Serena mentioned that we used a survey. We adapted a survey that was used in the late 70s and early 80s, both in the UK and the US, to assess the problems of long-term imprisonment. And our findings are very, very similar in terms of the themes that come up most. So the things that people find most difficult about serving a long sentence are missing people on the outside, worrying about people on the outside, feeling that they've lost control over their lives, feeling that their lives have no meaning, and so on. And we find this across these studies. So I think that's telling us something quite powerful about the sort of inherent pains and difficulties of being given a long sentence. Anna Schlier's question, yes, so in our follow-up study, we will be using the concepts of things like the breadth and depth of imprisonment. For people who are not familiar with those concepts, the breadth of imprisonment is about the way in which the sentence continues to shape life beyond the prison. And so when we hopefully get to interview the men and women who have been released, one of the main areas of interest is how possible is it to shake off the impact of serving many years in custody. And there's lots of research about resettlement, which is about the difficulties people might have with things like housing and employment. But we're primarily interested in things like internalized stigma or the impact of the life license. So it's about the way that the sentence, it doesn't stop at the point of release. The depth of imprisonment is about, I guess, the sense of distance from the world outside. And one of the things we hope to press people a bit on that when we interview them in the follow-up study, partly to get a sense of the points in the sentence at which they feel most isolated, alienated, angry, and so on. It's not completely clear to us that will always be at the end of the sentence. It might well be nearer the beginning. The other thing, just to say something about what one of the other topics we're particularly interested in the follow-up study, is we're going to ask people some very quite precise questions about what we call reflexivity. And what we mean by this is we want to, because what we found was that people serving life sentences were engaged in these internal conversations, so kind of conversations with themselves about who they were and what they might become. We want to ask people to talk to us very specifically about the nature of those conversations that they have, what they reflect on, what they rehearse, what they plan, and also who they take into consideration when they're making these decisions about how to live their lives within and beyond the prison. So that all of those things will be part of the focus.
Okay, well, thank you, Ben. So we're really only, in terms of the research, probably only halfway through, but so there's much to look forward to. But for the event, I think we are now sadly at an end. A couple of things to say in conclusion. I gather some people may have had a bit of difficulty accessing the event at the start, so really sorry about that if that happened. However, the speakers have all been recorded, so we will be emailing a link to everyone who attended, so you'll be able to get the whole thing. So I hope that resolves that. Don't forget, if you haven't done it, to fill in the poll that Serena circulated or put up, I think, about where people are from. So let's do that. And finally, of course, last but not least, to congratulate Ben, Susie and Serena again for a really fantastic bit of work. And thank you for presenting it to us and giving us the chance to discuss it with you. Thank you to our panelists, I think, for really great contributions too, providing some perspective. And thank you, all the audience, the 200 plus of you that attended. There were loads of really good questions. We could have gone on all afternoon, I think. So I'm sorry we could only scratch the surface. But if you haven't read the book, do that. And I hope this is a conversation that in our different ways, actually we'll be able to continue for some time to come. So thank you. And that's it, I think.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
Thank
Nick.
you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.